The Free Thinker Show. Ignite your mind, challenge the norm.
Teens and crimes, like the story we think we know, right? But this one from Florida, this one's got layers. We're talking 3 teenagers, all gone, murdered.
And the way it unfolds, like you think it's one thing, a hit and run maybe, then bam, it just twists. Totally different story.
It all starts with a 911 call, Marion County, Florida, March 30th, 2023, late, almost midnight. This neighbor, they hear something, but it's dark, confusing.
A crash, gunshots, hard to say in the moment.
Right, so they call it in, and that's when they find her, Leah Silvernail, young girl, just 16, bleeding on the side of the road.
And everyone's thinking tragic accident, right, but Leah's injuries, gunshot wound, changes everything.
Not your typical hit and run.
Not at all. And the witness statements, all over the place. Some saw a guy running, others a car slamming into a dumpster, total chaos.
So now the police are searching not just for a suspect, but for Leah's car too. A white Chevy Crowd, gone, vanished.
And as if things couldn't get worse, the next morning, they find Michael Hodo, also dead. Another teenager, another gunshot wound.
And Michael's connection to Leah.
Her boyfriend.
So now it's 2 murders, connected. Detectives are digging into their lives, talking to Leah's grandparents. She lived with them, her best friend Gabby. And that's when names like Reaper and 35 start coming up, like something out of a movie, you know.
Except this is real life. And those names lead them to 2 people. Robert Reaper Robinson, 17 years old, already in juvie for something else. And Christopher, 35, Atkins.
Okay, 2 suspects, got it. But something about that second name.
Chris. Yeah, he's 12. 12 years old, caught up in this whole thing.
12, that's a kid.
And listening to the interrogation tapes, it's like a pressure cooker. Fear, lies, you can practically hear it.
So they bring in Rob and Chris, start asking questions, and what's the story?
That's just it. There isn't one story. Chris, especially, he keeps changing his story. His mother, Ashley, she's in the room with him, and you can hear her falling apart as he contradicts himself again and again.
And in the middle of all this, they keep mentioning KTM. What is that, some kind of code? A gang.
It's chilling, actually. They try to downplay it at first, say it's nothing. But KTM stands for cutthroat mentality. And according to someone who knew Michael, it's not some game, it's a real gang. Dangerous.
Wait, so this isn't just some teenage fight gone wrong. This is organized.
That's what it's starting to look like. And remember how Leah's car was missing? Well, they find it. Submerged in a lake.
Oh,
Inside Leah and Michael's phones. But still no sign of Camille. And with this KTM thing hanging over everything, everyone's on edge.
It just keeps getting worse. So we've got 2 murders, a missing girl, and this KTM thing, cutthroat mentality. Doesn't sound good. What's next?
This is where it gets really intense. You've got Rob and Chris both telling their stories, but they're all over the place, right? Meanwhile, the forensics team, they're doing their thing. And what they find, well, it just darkens the picture even more.
The evidence starts to matter more now, right? What they find.
Exactly. See, Rob and Chris, they both talked about hearing gunshots, like someone else was doing the shooting. But the lab results come back. The shell casings, the ones they found at the scene, and remember there were multiple, meaning more than one shooter, they matched the guns they found at Chris's house.
Hold on. So both of them, Rob and Chris, they had access to the guns used in the murders. That's huge. But if this KTM cutthroat mentality is all about, like, being ruthless, why go after their own friends, especially Leah?
That's the big question, isn't it? We may never know exactly why, what drove them to do this, but those interrogation tapes, they offer some clues, some disturbing ones. The pressure keeps building, and Chris, remember, he's just a kid. He breaks. He confesses to shooting Camille.
Camille? But she was still missing at this point, right?
Exactly. Chris's confession. That's how they find out what happened to Camille. The whole horrific story. He tells them after they shot Michael and Leah, Rob made him open the trunk of the car. Camille was inside.
Oh, my God. She was in the trunk this whole time.
Seems like it. Chris says he heard her say something like, watch out, right before the first shot. He says he fired once, didn't even know if he hit her, and then Rob fired again.
That's awful. And Rob, what's his side of this?
If anything, it's even more disturbing. Rob admits he shot Camille too, second time. Said she was still alive after Chris shot. Said he didn't want to do it, but that Taj would have killed him if he hadn't.
Taj. So he's involved now too. I remember from the video, they brought him in for questioning. But until now, it's just been his name, right? He was the one who cut off his ankle monitor right after the murders.
You got it. And Taj, he becomes a major part of this story now, but not how you'd think. Rob and Chris, they both point the finger at him. They say Taj was the mastermind, the one calling all the shots. Said they were terrified of him.
Classic tactic, right? Blame the guy who's not there to defend himself.
Okay.
But Kaj is caught eventually, isn't he? What's his story?
He is. They bring him in, and his version contradicts practically everything we've heard so far. He says he never even touched a gun that night, wasn't even there for the murders, says it was all Rob, that Rob planned it all, even deleted messages from Taj's phone before they were caught, trying to frame him. He even says Rob's plan all along was to pin the murders on him.
Wow, so it's a mess of accusations now. Who are the police supposed to believe? 3 teenagers, 3 different stories, all trying to save themselves, like a puzzle where the pieces won't fit.
And that's the thing with these cases. It's not just about the evidence, the physical stuff. It's about understanding how groups work, the power of peer pressure, and the fear, very real fear that can take over, especially with young people, especially when they're in way too deep. And this KTM thing, that just adds a whole other level to it.
Yeah, KTM. Can't forget about them. What's their role in all this?
Well, that's where it gets even more complicated. Remember those burner phones the boys were using? One of them had all these messages about KTM. And not just casual stuff. This wasn't just kids playing around with a fake gang. These messages, they suggest some serious organization, like a hierarchy, even a code of conduct.
So KTM, cutthroat mentality, it wasn't just a name. It was a whole way of life.
Yeah.
And not a good one.
Exactly. And even though Taj tries to distance himself from KTM, says he was just caught in the middle of what Rob was doing, it's obvious that KTM is a huge factor in what happened to Leah, Michael, and Camille. This wasn't just some random violence. It came from a place, a culture that glorifies that kind of violence. And these boys were caught right in the middle of it.
It's awful to think that this could happen, that these kids, because they're kids, right? They got caught up in something they probably didn't even understand.
And that's the heart of it, isn't it? The tragedy. This whole thing reminds us how destructive gangs can be, how they twist how young people think, and the damage they leave behind, not just for the victims, but whole communities.
Makes you think.
Yes.
And speaking of consequences, the episode ends with the boys going to trial as adults. What does that even mean for them? What are we talking about, justice-wise? Tried as adults. That's serious business, right? What does that even look like for them?
No kidding. We're not talking about juvie anymore. For Taj and Rob, it's multiple charges, 3 counts of first-degree murder, just for starters.
Wow.
And Chris, even though he's so young, he's still facing a murder charge for Camille.
It's just 3 families destroyed, 3 young lives just gone. And now these 3, they could be locked up for, what, most of their lives? Maybe all of them? It's heavy.
That's the thing about choices, right? They have consequences. And when you throw in something like KTM, this whole gang mentality, it escalates things fast. In the episode, it really drives home the human cost of all this. You see the families, how wrecked they are. Michael's dad, when he finds out, Camille's aunt, just lost, trying to make sense of it. And Chris's mom, she's got to live with the fact that her son, her 12-year-old son, was part of this.
Yeah, those moments, they get to you. You remember that these aren't just names in a story. This is real life, real people hurting because of this.
And it makes you ask, what is justice in a case like this? Can anything really make up for that kind of loss?
Right, like 3 people are gone. It makes you wonder about the bigger picture. You know, were there signs, things we missed, stuff that could have been done differently? Or is it just these individuals, are they fully to blame?
Those are the tough questions. And the episode, it doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but it makes us think about gangs, about why someone would want to belong to something like that, even knowing the risks. How fear can really mess you up, especially when you're young.
For sure. And KTM, what happened to them? Did the police ever, take them down?
That's an interesting point. The episode kind of leaves that hanging. We know KTM was a huge part of these kids' lives, but we don't really know what happened to the gang itself. Did they all scatter? Did the cops come down hard?
It's almost like, by not telling us everything, they're making us, the viewers, think about it more. Like, this case might be closed, but the problems that caused it, those are still out there.
Absolutely, and that's what makes this deep dive so powerful. It's more than just a true crime story. It's about understanding the why, the how, and what it means for all of us.
It stays with you, that's for sure. Makes you think, what can we learn from this? What can we do, in our own lives to stop stuff like this from happening again?
And maybe even more importantly, it makes us look at our own biases, how we think about young people and gangs and all that, because if we want to fix things, we got to understand them first.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But important. In this episode, I think it did a really good job of, laying it all out there, making us think.
Couldn't agree more. It's a dark look at what teenagers go through, the potential for things to go really wrong, even when it seems like everything's normal.
This whole case, it just shows you how important it is to understand what teens are dealing with these days. The pressure to fit in, to belong somewhere, even if it's the wrong place. It's a conversation we need to keep having.
100%. And this episode, perfect place to start. Even in the darkest stories, even with loss like this, there's always hope. For understanding, for preventing this from happening again, and for healing.
It's a lot to process. But the hard conversations, those are usually the ones we need to have most. So to everyone listening, don't stop asking questions. Talk about this with each other. And never, ever think you can't make a difference. You can.